Hey Flock, Mike here from Epic Duck Studios and welcome to the Epic Hobby. Today I'm going to be magnetizing a Dusk wolf from Privateer Press's new game Warcaster. The Dusk wolf comes with two head options or cortex options, which are the neural net cortex and the scout cortex. It's got two shoulder mounted weapons, which are the Talon rocket pod and the railgun, and three underarm weapons, the battle rifle, the flamethrower, and the ripper. So in total that's 7 pieces that need magnets, mounting to 4 magnetized points on the body. Right now I'm just dry fitting the different pieces, seeing how they work together before I go ahead and assemble them, just checking out the package contents and looking for any big mold lines to remove. Honestly, this is all pretty standard fare, and I'm going to skip right ahead to the final assembly and magnetizing, because that's much more important than just inspecting a bunch of metal parts. You're not going to get anything out of the ordinary here. So here's the railgun on the shoulder hardpoint, and it's actually tight enough that it will friction fit on there. And while that's great for putting a model together permanently, friction fits like that actually cause abrasion when you're putting them together magnetized. They'll chip away at the paint, so we want to actually file that away a little bit to make it a little bit easier to get the pieces on and off after. You can see the Talon rocket pod has much the same fit. It actually is pushed right on there and holding on its own. So both those shoulder mounted pieces we're going to want to just file down a little bit and make them just a tiny bit loose. Now the weapons underslung on the arms don't have that same problem, there's really nothing to kind of key them on there. They just roughly match the shape of the arms, so it's going to be a lot easier to magnetize these. Now the heads are sort of like the underarm joints in that they don't fit really snugly. It's not a friction fit, it just happens to be keyed well. You know, if I let that go, it's just going to fall right off. And so this is a place where we're going to really rely on the magnet to kind of pull the pieces together. To do the drilling, I'm going to be using a small 4-volt lithium powered drill and a couple quick change drill bits I've got. Now the drill bits are metric, and oddly enough my collection of magnets is not, it's all imperial. So I'll be using a micrometer just to measure the millimeter size of each magnet. And basically in every joint I want to use the largest possible magnet I can. After a little bit of trial and error, I found that the best size magnet here was a 1/8 inch magnet, so it's 1/8 inch wide and a 1/16 of an inch thick, which is about 3.2 millimeters. Now I've got a 3.5 millimeter drill bit, so I'll be using that to make the holes, which leaves me just a little bit of room around the magnet for super glue. Now this isn't strictly necessary, but the railgun has a small little just decorative bump on it, which makes it sit just a little bit off center from where the magnet would end up located on the shoulder. And by clipping this off, you can get the railgun, you know, much more in line with where the two magnets are going to meet nicely. Just makes a nice flush finish instead. So I'm just clipping that off and then filing it down a little bit. And it just really gets those two sort of flat surfaces in line with each other a little bit better. Now I'm just using an angle file to make the gap where the railgun sits on the shoulder just a little bit wider, and that's because, you know, as we tried earlier, it friction fit on there really snugly. We want it just a little bit loose because we don't want friction fitting to push our paint away. So now if I've got that filed down, it sits on there a little bit softer and it doesn't, you know, hold on tightly anymore, and that's kind of the key. So what I'm doing here is using a black dry erase marker to mark the part of the sort of overlapping flange that isn't overlapping, the part that's overhanging, and that'll let me find what the dead center of the actual overlap is. So I'm taking my micrometer, I'm going to measure basically from the outside part of the model just up to that line, and what I get there is 0.18 inches or 4.6 millimeters, and if I just cut that in half, then I know that I'm going to put my dead center of my magnet at 2.3 millimeters from the outside edge of this piece. Now, the very points of this micrometer are actually pretty sharp, and of course, hobby metal is pretty soft, so I can actually use this now to just score a tiny little dent into the railgun to know exactly where that dead center is. And with dead center marked, I can grab a push pin and just kind of elaborate on that hole, push it in a little bit further, and that'll give me a good guide for my drill bit to make sure it doesn't wander as I start to drill the actual hole. So here now I'm drilling a pilot hole using a pinning drill, and this pilot hole will again now guide the magnet hole. And I find this sort of stepping up of, you know, hole detail is really crucial to getting good straight magnetizing holes. If you just came in with, you know, the big drill bit and started blasting away at it, there's a good chance it'll skitter a little bit, or roll off center, and you're going to end up with, you know, an off-center magnet, and then that doesn't really fit your model together very well. So by marking the dead center and then drilling it out with a small drill bit, and then using that hole as a guide for the larger drill bit, you just get a more precise hole. And now that I know that my offset is 2.3 millimeters, I can just use that number going forward. So in this case, I'm going to use it on the back side of the micrometer. You can see there's an extra, you know, there's sort of one side is for measuring insides and one side is for measuring outsides. And I can use this now to mark the center of the hole on the shoulder itself, and that'll give me perfect alignment between the shoulder and the railgun. And with that marked, just go ahead and drill the pilot hole that the deeper hole will be using for a guide. So now I'm using my 3.5 millimeter drill bit in my electric drill, and I'm using this with very, very little back pressure. I'm not really pushing in hard here at all. Now this is actually a wood drill bit, but pewter is so soft it doesn't matter. This will just shred right through it if I'm, you know, too forceful. So you can see I'm doing this with little taps on the trigger, just kind of shaving away at it bit by bit. And once I'm fairly confident I'm deep enough, I'll just check it by actually placing a magnet in the hole and seeing if it sits flush with the surface. So the easiest way to do that is to pick up 2 or 3 magnets at a time and then just handle the outside ones while checking to make sure the inside one ends up sitting flush with the hole that's been drilled. And because I use an oversized drill bit, there is a little bit of give, but again, that just gives me room for the super glue to actually get in there. Now there's a little bit of burring just along the edge of the drilled hole here, so I'm just taking an X-Acto knife and just cleaning that up, making it nice and flush. Almost just like cleaning up a mold line. So once I'm happy with the hole, I get a single one of the magnets on the end of an X-Acto knife, and that's just to give me something metallic to hold it. Apply a little bit of super glue to it, and then work it into the hole I've drilled. Now the trick here, of course, is that it is magnetically held onto the X-Acto knife, so as I pull this away, the magnet's going to want to stay on the knife. So it's going to shimmy a little bit, and what I'm going to do then is use the back of a paintbrush, because of course that's non-magnetic, it's made of wood, and just use that to just align the magnet back up with the flush surface. Just push it around a little bit until it sits nice and flush. And then once I'm happy with the placement, I'm just going to dab a little bit of super glue activator on there to just set the super glue in place and keep the magnet from moving. Now because this was the first magnet I installed, the polarity on it doesn't matter at all, but this is now going to be the reference magnet for both the rocket pod and the railgun, because they obviously have to have the opposite polarity. Now, before I worry about the polarity on the railgun here, I'm going to just obviously drill the hole and check it for depth. And we don't really care about the polarity when we're checking depth. It's just when we go to glue the magnet in. So I'm going to go ahead, just drill my hole here, check it with a magnet, and then if I need to burrow it out a little bit deeper, I will. So you can see that magnet doesn't quite sit flush. I can see a little bit of it still showing up above the surface of the hole, so I'm going to drill it out just a little bit deeper. And once the hole is deep enough, I want to get a magnet flipped correctly by aligning the polarity to the shoulder, and then basically grabbing the opposite side of that magnet to install into the railgun. So the easiest way to check polarity is just stick a small stack of magnets onto that shoulder, and I can tell they're all going to be aligned the right way, and then that's how it's going to go into the gun. So I just take an X-Acto knife, slip it underneath the topmost magnet, pull all the other ones off, and right there, that's the side facing up that's going to go into the railgun. So we've got our polarity already adjusted. And with the polarity all determined, it's time to just get some super glue on there, set the magnet in the hole, align it up with the tip of a paintbrush, and use some activator to lock it in place. So here I'm test fitting the magnet joint, and that seems pretty solid. I can turn this right upside down. That railgun's not falling off. I'm really happy with that, so I'm going to proceed forward and get the rocket pod magnetized up as well. Now on the rocket pod, I have to clip off that same little flange to basically just make this fit the same way the railgun fit. So just clipping off that little rectangle, filing it down, and then we'll go ahead, mark center, drill it, and all the same steps I took on the railgun. Once again, I'm going to bust out the micrometer and measure out 2.3 millimeters and use that to mark off where the center of the magnet should be from the modified side of the rocket pod. Then using the sharp little point on the end of the multimeter, using that to just score the pewter a little bit so I can drill dead center. One more time with the pinning drill, just drilling a little bit of a pilot hole so that when I use the larger drill bit, it keeps center and true. And then it's time to actually bore out the hole for the magnet. Again, I'm using a slightly oversized drill bit. So this is a 3.5 millimeter drill bit for what is basically a 3.2 millimeter magnet. So here I'm taking the magnet I'm going to be using, setting it against the shoulder to set the polarity correctly, and then pushing that into the rocket pod, applying a little bit of super glue, placing the magnet in the rocket pod, using a wooden tool like a paintbrush handle to just make sure it's nice and flush and level, just kind of, smoothing it out a little bit, and then finally taking some super glue activator and then just locking down that super glue so the magnet won't move. And here we're testing the fit, and we're perfect. That's great. It doesn't really move at all. So next up, I need to mount magnets on the underside of each of the Dusk Wolf's arms, and they need to be facing the same way so that any weapons can be swapped from one arm to the other. Now here I'm just dry fitting all three weapons against each arm and just making sure they sit kind of flush, and the reason for that is there might be a little bit of a mold line or some flash, etc., kind of keeping them from just sitting nice and snug. And you want to just check that before you go ahead and start, expecting everything to go together. If you do run into any problems, just file them down. Now on each arm, there's this 45-degree inclined angle on the underside of the arm, and it made the most sense to put the magnet here because it's kind of the most central point, so it's going to be the most evenly distributed load against the magnet. Whereas if I put it too far forward or too far back on either of those flat planes adjacent to it, there's the chance that the magnet might cause a weapon to droop a little bit, so this kind of helps even out the load. And here I am just drilling a pilot hole that I can then use with the larger drill bit to mount that 1/8 inch magnet in afterwards. So you can see me here pressing my finger against the drill bit and pulling it out to check the depth. That's basically me right now just checking if my drilled pilot hole is deep enough to secure the magnet, because we know how deep the magnet is. And so I just do that a couple times. I pull the drill bit out, check how deep I've gone against the drill bit with just my fingertip. And from here now I've got to drill in. Now I want to be nice and slow here because the drill bit is just a tiny bit smaller than the entire surface of the arm. And I'm going to take this really slow. I don't want to blow it aside at all. So you want to do some fairly gentle scraping with the drill bit. Basically, I'm drilling like a 3.5 millimeter hole in a 4 millimeter surface, and that can be a little bit nerve-wracking because if you're even a little bit off center, one side or the other is going to at least buckle a little bit, if not just burn right out. So it's just a matter of being patient, being a little bit slow. You can see I don't have a lot of torque going here. You can almost count the revolutions. And I'm not putting a lot of pressure against the drill bit so that it's not chewing away too much at any one time. Now I'm just checking the depth of the magnet, making sure I've got enough room in there. And it looks pretty flush, so I'm going to go ahead and just take my X-Acto, deburr the hole a little bit, and then get the magnet glued in here. Now this is the first magnet going in, so the polarity of this one doesn't matter, but I'll be using this one as a reference point for every other magnet on these arms and interchangeable weapons. Now I didn't show this on the first arm, but this is the way, because it's a small, simple rectangle, this is how I found dead center. What it is, I took an X-Acto knife and just lightly scored the surface, splitting it in half, then rotated it and did it again. And because this is such a small surface, it's really easy to eyeball this. I mean, you might be off by, a 1/10 of a millimeter or something, but not enough to worry about. And what I've done is I make this plus sign, and the intersection of those two lines is going to be basically dead center. What I'm doing now is just taking a push pin and just pushing in a little bit there, so that when I take my pinning drill and start drilling, I've already got a tiny little guide for it. And that gives me a pretty reliable dead center mark that I can then use as my pilot hole and then my magnet hole from there. So now I'm using that same X marking trick to mark where the center point is going to be on each of the weapons, and I'll be drilling them just in the same fashion. Basically at this point I'm assembly lining all of the magnetizing I have to do, so I'm getting all the weapons and both arms drilled to the same point, so I can just bang 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 install all the magnets back to back, and really make sure that I'm not accidentally flipping polarities or anything like that. So here I'm installing the first magnet in one of the arms, and this is going to be what I call the index magnet. It's the magnet that all the other polarities have to work with. So the other arm will get the same polarity as this one, and of course each of the 3 weapons will get the opposite polarity. So again, I'm just using the paintbrush handle to level out the magnet, make sure it's sitting nice and flush with the surface of the arm, and then adding a little bit of superglue activator just to make sure it gets locked in place. So the second magnet I'm going to install here is just in one of the weapons. Doesn't really matter which one, but what I'm doing here is I put the magnet against the arm, grabbed it from underneath with the X-Acto knife, and that way I know that the face-up part of the magnet is the part that'll get buried in the arm itself. Once I've got one weapon created, I can then use it as the index for the second arm. And then at that point, I've got 2 different references I can base the other 2 weapons off of, and everything's pretty straightforward from there. So at this point, magnets are installed in both arms, and I just have 2 weapons left to go, and they're just going to be a repeat of the exact same process. You know, making sure the magnet has the right polarity, pulling it out, adding some super glue, setting it in place, sedimenting it down with the super glue activator, and then repeating for the other weapon. Now, I should note that the superglue activator isn't essential to this process. I originally did this on my live stream, and I just like to use the activator because it moves things along a little bit better for a live audience. It's certainly not an essential step, and you can, just let your superglue cure on its own if you don't want to do that. So here now I'm checking the fit of all 3 weapons on both arms, and everything looks like it's golden. It's all snapping in nicely, staying put. The shape of the arm really helps keep the weapon in place, so I don't really need any extra support to keep them from spinning around or pivoting. So the last thing to magnetize here are the 2 cortexes to the main body of the Warjack, and this is actually the most challenging magnetization project in the whole part here. They don't fit at a really smooth flat surface like all the other guns do. They actually have almost like a 45-degree angle that they meet at, which makes it a little bit weird to get a magnet in there. The largest magnet I could reasonably fit into the cortex was a 332-inch wide magnet, which is just a little bit over 2 millimeters. It's about 2.3 millimeters. Now I've got a 2.5 millimeter drill bit, which I'll be using for the hole itself, and you'll see that it's actually really difficult to drill these holes, specifically because the cortexes are just so small. There's really nothing to hold onto for leverage. Once you get past the pilot hole stage and you're drilling with the electric drill or a larger drill bit, how much it bites into the pewter actually causes more torsion than your fingers can really hold back easily. So you'll see as I drill this, basically the whole cortex, the whole head just gets stuck on the end of the drill bit and starts spinning with it. And what I tried doing first was switching to a smaller drill bit. I don't recall exactly, but I think it was a 1.8 or a 2 millimeter drill bit. And the smaller hole helps because it's basically exerting less force, but it's still not perfect. It's still, catches on the end of the drill bit, and of course it's just not large enough anyway, so I'm still faced with the idea that I'm going to have to drill it out. What ended up working, you can actually see here, I flipped hands because my right hand's stronger than my left hand, so I'm operating the drill now with my left, and on my right hand I can actually just spin the cortex in place against the drill bit, or hold it, just clamp it down a little bit tighter, and that was enough extra strength to finish drilling that out. So now I'm back to marking the X on the neck here, and this again is not really a great location. You can see it's going in, it's a bit of a flat surface, but it's in this sort of concave area. Basically, the magnets on the neck are not going to form nice tight bonds the way they did on the arm because it's just such a complicated joint, and there's not really room on either side to fully fit a magnet. But because the heads are so tiny, magnetic forces working across a short distance are enough to keep them in place anyway. Now, of course, drilling the larger hole in the main body was not challenging at all because there is a lot to hold on to here for torque as opposed to the head, which is just a small, almost spherical object you have to just squish between your fingers and hope for the best. Now, because I haven't installed a magnet in either the neck or one of the cortexes yet, we don't have reference yet, so this will be the index magnet that I base the polarity of the 2 cortex magnets on. So as with all the other joints, I'm just placing a magnet now against the neck and using an X-Acto knife to pull that off with the correct face out, which I know will then get faced into the cortex. You'll also notice that I drilled the holes in the cortex a little bit deeper. The magnet's not sitting flush, but it's actually recessed a little bit. And I used the tip of a paintbrush to make sure I push it into that recess. And that's because I don't want that flush connection, because they're not quite at the same angle, just because of the shape of this joint. So I'm relying on magnetic force across short distances to actually make these sit in the right location. And if the magnet had sat flush with the surface, I'd probably actually have the head at a little bit of a janky angle. And test fitting both the heads here, both the cortexes, they look like they fit really nicely. They're, lined up in all the right places. There's some sort of little keyed shapes that make them sit in the right place, and they seem to be doing their job. So I've gone ahead and fully assembled the Dusk Wolf and got it mounted on a base, and here I'm just testing out all the magnet points. So we've got the railgun on the shoulder, the Ripper and battle rifle on the hands, and the Scout Cortex. Alright, this chunky boy is ready for some paint. I hope you have fun magnetizing your own Warjacks and do something epic.
Hey, thanks for watching my video. If you enjoyed that one, please hit like and subscribe, and don't forget to hit the bell so you get notifications when I post new videos in the future. If you want to take your support even further, you can do that at patreon.com/epicduck. Every little bit helps keep the lights on and the paint flowing, puts new models on the table so I can make interesting videos, and most importantly, puts a roof over my family's head and food on the table. You can also join me for live painting shows several times a week at twitch.tv/epicduckstudios. I'd love if you came by and watched the show sometime and followed the channel. I want to give a big thank you to everyone who's supported my content over the years, both past and present. It's been an absolutely wild ride, and I couldn't do this without all the wonderful fans and flockers out there. The hobby community is just an amazing group of people, and you really make this worth doing. So let's just keep on doing this together, making more content, and just being fantastic together for years to come. Thanks again for watching, and until next time, do something epic.